unfortunately, for John Hoover, who claims to be, or many people see him as an expert on Ibn Taymiyyah in his field, it's just, I hate to say it, but it's really not a good attempt from John Hoover. Today's episode is a little bit niche. Some people may not be familiar with the content that I'm going to speak about, but I think it's extremely important, at least for a good portion of my audience. So I hope and pray that this is a benefit to the people watching. Now, I'm going to make a point here about a specific Western scholar, Western academic by the name of John Hoover. But I don't want people to be confused. This video is not meant to be a blatant attack against John Hoover. Everything I'm going to say is going to, inshallah, God willing, be backed up with evidence and support. I have nothing personally against him. I don't have a vendetta against him. But unfortunately, he is somebody that has been put forward as an expert in Islamic thought from a Western perspective, specifically on the scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, who is a very important scholar in Islamic tradition. And he's seen as one of the foremost representatives of Ibn Taymiyyah's thought, at least in English. And to the point that even many people who follow Ibn Taymiyyah's understanding and have an affinity towards Ibn Taymiyyah as a thinker and as a theologian, many of those same people actually rely on John Hoover's works in English for his understanding of Ibn Taymiyyah, for what Ibn Taymiyyah actually taught, what he believed, all of those sorts of things. So he's very influential in that regard. But again, I want people to understand, this video is not meant to just merely focus on John Hoover. I'm going to use John Hoover and his supposed expertise in Ibn Taymiyyah to enlighten the audience about a much deeper problem from my personal perspective with Western academia or Orientalist studies of Islam and the Islamic tradition. Okay, so let me share my screen here to get you guys up to speed. As I said, for people who don't know who John Hoover is, he is a Western scholar. He is somebody who is seen as an expert, at least in English-speaking world today, on the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah, his life, his works, his theology, etc. Now, he recently published on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which, if you guys are not familiar with it, it's a very standard work that on niche topics, very specific topics, many times, the person who writes the entry, in this case on Ibn Taymiyyah is John Hoover, are said to be or thought to be one of the leading experts on the topics that they're writing about for the Stanford Encyclopedia entries. Okay, so it's a really well-respected online encyclopedia for philosophy and theology, religion, etc., etc. So it's interesting that such a big figure, actually, to note, like Ibn Taymiyyah, didn't have an entry where I think Ghazali and many other thinkers in the Islamic tradition have had their own page on this website, this encyclopedia, for quite a while. So very recently, just in May 22nd, this was first published, of this year, 2024, John Hoover published the first entry on Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, sometimes periodically after they're cataloged, they get updated throughout the years. Hopefully, John Hoover will correct some of the, I have to be quite frank, egregious errors that he makes in this article in trying to explain what Ibn Taymiyyah's positions are. But if not, hopefully at the very least, this video will educate the audience out there to at least be cautious with what he's writing and what he's saying. So this is the page here. This is Stanford Encyclopedia. I'm going to focus, there's so much to focus on, but I'm going to focus on a few key examples to illustrate that, and I don't think, and I could be wrong, I don't think John Hoover is malicious. I don't think he's trying to distort and purposely misrepresent Ibn Taymiyyah. I think that his job is extremely difficult. Why? I want people to understand this. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote in classical Arabic. John Hoover is writing in English today, modern English. And he is trying to convey sometimes complicated ideas. I want people to understand how difficult of a job this is. You have to be an expert in Arabic to be able to understand and read and understand Ibn Taymiyyah's thought very well. You have to be then more specifically familiar with a lot of his works, because Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a lot. He wasn't a very systematic thinker in the way that he wrote. So you have to kind of read scattered around in different works. Then you have to be familiar with the popular theological milieu at the time and what was Ibn Taymiyyah engaging with. So you have to be familiar with Arazi and other thinkers around the same time. So all of that just from that perspective, to understand it in that context. Then if you want to convey it into English in a modern context and transport the ideas accurately and properly, not just by the wording, but by the meaning, so that people properly understand what Ibn Taymiyyah's thought actually was, you have to be an expert in English, in modern English, to be able to convey that properly. And then you also have to be very well informed of the modern Western philosophical society and practice. Okay, you have to be familiar with modern analytic philosophy and theology. How are these terms used today? Because even if you understand Ibn Taymiyyah in his Arabic context in the classical period, you have to be able to not only put that in simple English, but if you're doing it in a scholarly manner, in a sophisticated theological and philosophical way, in which you're using the proper terminology to convey Ibn Taymiyyah's thought and idea. So I want to say from the outset, this is a huge project, not only for John Hoover, but anyone who is trying to do something of that sort. And unfortunately, many times what I see, at least in one of those three categories, the person who is taking on that project does not have a sufficient degree of knowledge in either one or more, or sometimes all of those three fields, and therefore it shows in the end product of their work. Now, John Hoover, as I said, I don't believe, and I could be wrong, that he's maliciously trying to misrepresent Ibn Taymiyyah, but nevertheless, I think, and with all due respect to John Hoover, I think he's extremely deficient in especially modern philosophy, modern Western philosophy. I think it's very clear, as we'll see, even the terms that he applies to Ibn Taymiyyah, even if he has a semblance of an idea of what Ibn Taymiyyah is trying to get at, it's totally the wrong term to use in the modern context. He doesn't seem to be very well read in modern Western analytic theology and philosophy, and therefore shows when he tries to transport Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas to a modern audience who is familiar or who are familiar with that type of literature. Now, I said a lot, I explained a lot just to give a background, but let me give some examples to try to illustrate what I'm saying. Okay, so this is from the article here. This is in the second section, which is labeled Ontology, and it says this: contrary to the dominant currents of post-classical Islamic thought, Ibn Taymiyyah's ontology is physicalist or materialist. And ontology just means what are things made up of the world? What does he believe the world is made up of? He says Ibn Taymiyyah's ontology is physicalist or materialist, which shows that he's using physicalist and materialist in a synonym fashion. They're synonyms, right? And I'm going to challenge that in a second. Then he says, all existence, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, including God, are concrete particulars capable of being perceived, or mahsus, by the five senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Whatever cannot be perceived by the five senses does not exist. Even existence in the unseen world, right, or the world of the ghaib, the unseen, are accessible to sense perception under certain conditions. The unseen, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, is not an intellectual world or a world of immanent images. Instead, the unseen world, like the seen, consists of concrete particulars with temporal and spatial dimensions that may be perceived by the senses when unimpeded. Now, there's more that can be said, but I want to focus on the first couple sentences. So he says that Ibn Taymiyyah is a physicalist or materialist, And then in the next sentence says that according to Ibn Taymiyyah, anything whatsoever that exists, so whatever Ibn Taymiyyah attributes existence to in one form or another, including God, everything that exists must be perceived by the five senses and then leaves them. He mentions them, right? And there's no ambiguity. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Now I want to ask this question before I give my reading. Do you think that he is saying that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that anything that exists can be perceived by all five senses? Or, meaning that anything exists is not only perceived by sight and hearing, but also by smell, taste, and touch? Or is he saying, no, Ibn Taymiyyah believes anything that exists just has to be perceived by only one of those senses? I'll leave that up for you. I think that if he thinks that Ibn Taymiyyah says that anything that exists must be perceived by all five senses, that's even a more radical hypothesis, which is easily disproved. But even on the lesser hypothesis of saying that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that anything that exists must be perceived by those specific five senses, that is also wrong. And I'm going to demonstrate that and show how John Hoover himself contradicts himself later in the article. But before I get to that, he labels Ibn Taymiyyah as a physicalist or materialist. Now, as I said, these are modern philosophical categories. So let's go to another article, which is on physicalism on the same website, an expert in the field writing this entry on physicalism. Let's see how he defines it. Then we'll come back to Ibn Taymiyyah and see if they actually match up. Okay, so this is the entry on physicalism on the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on physicalism on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on physicalism. And in the very first part, 1.1, terminology, listen to what the author says, who is describing what physicalism means in the modern philosophical context. Physicalism is sometimes known as materialism. Now notice John Hoover used materialism and physicalism in a synonymous fashion. Indeed, one strand of contemporary usage, the term physicalism and materialism are interchangeable. Okay, so fair enough. That may be used in some contexts, so John Hoover is not too far off there. But then further down, I want to take note of something. Okay, so then further down in the same section, he says, the author in the same section on physicalism, physicalism is not a linguistic thesis for contemporary philosophers. And this is one reason why the words materialism and physicalism are now often interpreted interchangeably. Okay, so again, fair enough. John Hoover is not too far off with him using those terms synonymously. Then I want to go to another section here. Okay, so then in the same section, a little bit further down, it says this. For one thing, many contemporary physicalists do in fact use the word materialism to describe their doctrine, referring to Smart, 1963. Moreover, while physicalism is no doubt related to physics, it is also related to physical object. And this, in turn, is very closely connected with the material object, and via that with matter. In this entry, I will adopt the policy of using both terms interchangeably, though I will typically refer to the thesis we will discuss as physicalism. So the author's making it clear, similar to John Hoover, he's using physicalism and materialism interchangeably. Okay? So far, not too big of a problem yet, but we'll see what the problem is here in just a second. So this now is in section 2.2 on the article on physicalism, which is labeled Identity Physicalism. Okay, so this is now going to be something very important to know. He says, consider the variety of dualism, usually called property dualism, which I don't know, it doesn't seem like John Hoover really understands what that is. Property dualism says that A, every particular is a physical particular, but B, some particulars, example, human beings, have psychological properties wholly distinct from any physical properties. The contrast here is with substance dualism. The substance dualist agrees with the property dualist that some particulars have psychological properties wholly distinct from any physical properties, but they will add that such particulars are themselves non-physical. Token physicalism, physicalism according to 3, is certainly inconsistent with substance dualism, Substance dualism entails that some particulars are non-physical. Token physicalism denies it, but token physicalism is compatible with property dualism. Indeed, property dualism entails that token physicalism is true. On the other hand, property dualism is usually understood as being inconsistent with physicalism in any form. So I know there's a lot there to take in, but I want people to understand he's explaining what property dualism is. And I think the best way to possibly categorize Ibn Taymiyyah's thought is that he's a property dualist. He's not somebody who believes that all objects are physical and can be sensed by those mere five senses, universals, and those things are, in some sense, mental properties that are not merely reduced to physical objects. Okay, so Ibn Taymiyyah would be considered, closest way to categorize him, I think, would be a property dualist. And he makes very clear in explaining on this entry on physicalism that property dualism is usually understood to be inconsistent with physicalism in any form. So to understand Ibn Taymiyyah as a physicalist, when he's a property dualist, believes that there are these mental entities or properties that are not sensed by merely those five senses listed by John Hoover, and they cannot be reduced purely to physical objects. Then to say that Ibn Taymiyyah is a physicalist, while at the same time he's a property dualist, is contradictory, is inconsistent, is just flat out wrong. I want to illustrate how John Hoover isn't completely aware of, more broadly, what Ibn Taymiyyah's ontology is and how he's just totally miscategorizing this. Okay, so right under that, in the same section there on ontology, after he accused or said Ibn Taymiyyah is a physicalist or materialist and believes that anything that exists can be experienced by all five senses, then he says, parallel to this physicalism, so he repeats it again, Ibn Taymiyyah denies that universals exist in extramental reality. He rejects universals existing independently of particulars, Platonic realism, or as shared essences or quiddities within particulars that the mind abstracts as universals. And I've spoken in other videos about what universals are, so if you haven't seen them, go check it out. He's saying Ibn Taymiyyah rejects Platonic realism and Aristotelian or Avicennan moderate realism, which is correct. Shared meanings and universal notions abstracted from concrete particulars in the extramental world exist only in the mind. So when I say that something green exists and it's one green object, and that I apply that same meaning of another green object, the meaning of green exists only in the mind, but not in the objects or in some Platonic realm. So far that's correct. Then he says, there is, for example, no extramental absolute human in which concrete and particular humans participate, or of which they are instantiations. And there is no real quiddity or essence human that exists in every human. There are only ontologically distinct existence that a mind groups together under a shared meaning or mental universal called human. Ibn Taymiyyah's rejection of real universals is often called nominalism by Halak. And now he makes a good correction here, so I got to give credit to John Hoover. But he says, but it has also been argued that conceptualism is the better label, which is right, and we're all about here correcting and making sure we use better labels. Conceptualism acknowledges the existence of universals in the mind, whereas nominalism may imply rejection of that as well. Exactly. So these shared meanings that people think exist, nominalism says they don't exist in the Platonic realm, they don't exist in an Aristotelian sense in particulars, and they don't even exist in the mind. They're not real whatsoever. Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't believe that, so he's better categorized as a conceptualist. And notice he's admitting that Ibn Taymiyyah believes that these mental entities don't exist in extramental reality. They don't exist in physical reality, but yet he still affirms their existence. So this contradicts the previous paragraph when John Hoover said, well, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, anything that exists can be experienced by those five senses, and anything that exists is either physical or material, in the physical world, but then he's admitting that Ibn Taymiyyah believes in conceptual or mental realities that are in the mind. It's not that they don't exist as a nominalist. They are real, exist in the mind, but not in physical reality. Well, then he can't be a physicalist. And this goes along with his property dualism, right? So it's very clear. Now let me go to another section here where he makes basically the same point. And this is all in the same section on ontology, so I'm just not sure how he didn't put these things together. So then he says, Ibn Taymiyyah also maintains that certain rational principles obtain universally. Exactly, they're rational, they're mental, they exist in the mind. But then he says, both in the mind and in extramental reality. These principles accord with his physicalist ontology. And they include logical axioms like the law of non-contradiction and the law of excluded middle. How could he say that according to Ibn Taymiyyah, these are mental entities that don't have an extramental existence in the previous paragraph? And he's saying, and he's using examples like the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle. Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't believe in the law of excluded middle or the law of non-contradiction, logical axioms or rational principles that are out just floating around somewhere. He believes that they're mental entities that are in the mind, but nevertheless, they still exist. So it doesn't accord with his physicalist ontology because he doesn't believe that the law of non-contradiction is a physical entity. He believes it's a real entity, it's a mental entity, which therefore proves he's not a physicalist in the sense that is understood in modern philosophy. So I don't know where John Hoover is confusing this. He just seems to be mixing up ideas, not labeling things properly, and just very confused on a bunch of these points. Okay, let me go to the next section now on epistemology. Okay, so this is in the first part here, section 3 on epistemology, ways of knowing, 3.1. He says, Ibn Taymiyyah's epistemology is based on sense perception, report, reason or aql, and the human natural constitution, fitra. Sense perception is both outer and inner sense. Well, where was the clarification before about the different senses? Outer sense perception comes through the five senses. So notice what he mentioned before the five senses. He said, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, whatever exists must be experienced by the five senses. But then he makes a further distinction. There's outer sense, which are the five senses, and then for Ibn Taymiyyah, there's another inner sense, which refers to these realities, right? It perceives the particulars of the visible world in this life, and it perceives God in the hereafter. Inner sense perception, which is totally different than the five senses, is of hunger, thirst, joy, pain, the existence of one's own soul, the existence of God. Sense perception, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, is immediate and necessary in the sense that it cannot be denied. So here he makes a further distinction between outer and inner sense, which he didn't acknowledge before, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, and made it seem like it's only the outer sense, and Ibn Taymiyyah is a complete physicalist, and the only things that exist are physical entities. And now he makes a clarification saying, no, there's a further division. He believes in the five senses, but he also believes that things that exist according to only the inner sense, like what? Hunger, thirst, joy, pain, the existence of one's own soul, and the existence of God. Well, of course, Ibn Taymiyyah believes that God exists, that his own soul exists, that hunger, thirst, joy, pain are real things, but yet they're experienced by the inner sense, not merely by the five senses. So that refutes the original claim that, strictly speaking, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, the only things that exist are what can be limited to the five senses. No, there are these other mental properties and aspects which do exist according to Ibn Taymiyyah, and yet are not limited to the five senses. So we just see, unfortunately, a bit of a contradictory notion here. So I want to move on to another section here, which is on causality and theodicy. And here it's just more of John Hoover. Again, I don't think it's intentional, but it's just really poorly worded how he's trying to explain what Ibn Taymiyyah's position actually is. Okay, so let me go down here. Okay, so this is section 4.5, Causality and Theodicy. Again, John Hoover says, Ash'ari theologians object that a God who acts for wise purposes would be needy and dependent on those acts to attain perfection. So actually, this is something that I mentioned on Twitter recently. The Ash'aris have lost their minds, but unfortunately, at least John Hoover understands this part, that's the Ash'ari position. Ibn Taymiyyah counters that it is rational for agents to be perfected by their acts, and that it is a greater perfection to create things for wise purposes at the right times than to create without purpose. God is self-sufficient, not in the sense of being free to act or not act without reason, the Ash'ari view, but in needing no help in the act of creation. Now, some people may think this is a bit nitpicky, but the honest reality is that the way that he's trying to convey Ibn Taymiyyah's position is not really correct. Yes, Ibn Taymiyyah is extremely harsh of the Ash'ari position of the denial of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala acting for reasons. Why did he create? He has a reason for why he creates, why he sustains, why he judges, why he guides certain people. This is our position as ethicists and the position that Ibn Taymiyyah and the Quran and Sunnah, quite frankly, represent. The Ash'aris deny this. They say that God does not act for any reason. The comeback on Twitter is to say, oh no, Jake, you're misrepresenting. They say he acts for a reason, but he's not obliged to act for any particular reason. That's not true. They explicitly say that he doesn't act for any reason whatsoever. There is no intrinsic, eternal attribute of hikmah or any aspect of intentionality in guiding God's action. Hikmah is only in creation. It's not on the side of God. Anyway, that's kind of a sidebar. But here's the problematic part here for how he's conveying Ibn Taymiyyah's position. He says, Ibn Taymiyyah counters that it is rational for agents to be perfected by their acts, and that it is a greater perfection to create things for wise purposes. Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is perfected in the past tense by his acts. No. Ibn Taymiyyah's view, which would be more accurate to say, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God, is eternally perfect. He's always perfect. He never loses his perfection. He never gains perfection. However, any act that he performs or anything he wills to do at any given time is perfect in that moment. So the best way to say it is that he's eternally perfect, and his perfection is always maintained no matter what he does. But he's not perfected by his acts. His perfection is constantly maintained. And he's not in need of anything. He's not in need of acting. It's just the fact that he does act for wise purposes. So to make it seem like, oh, he's kind of God, Ibn Taymiyyah believes that God is being perfected by those acts, that's inaccurate. He's eternally perfect. He doesn't become perfect. He doesn't lose his perfection. Anytime he acts, he performs the most perfect act at that moment and constantly maintains his perfection. Section 6, which is on metaethics. So now a totally different category, right? So here we go. So he's talking about Ibn Taymiyyah's metaethics. And this is such a bad way to explain Ibn Taymiyyah's position. I mean, it's just really strange. So this is section 6, metaethics. In the second paragraph, John Hoover says, like other post-classical Muslim jurists, now pay attention to language there, Ibn Taymiyyah sometimes overrides explicit legal prohibitions on the grounds of benefit and necessity. For example, Islamic law forbids eating carrion. Ibn Taymiyyah permits eating it if necessary to avoid starvation. Now, if you read this, the fact that he's calling Ibn Taymiyyah a post-classical Muslim jurist, he says that Ibn Taymiyyah is overriding like classical juristic opinions and legal prohibitions on the grounds of benefit and necessity, and then gives the example of carrion, which is clearly prohibited in the Quran. And he said, but Ibn Taymiyyah permits it only in the case that it's necessary to avoid starvation. Now, he's not wrong that Ibn Taymiyyah has that opinion, but it's not his opinion. It's nothing novel. It's nothing to even note on a passage on Ibn Taymiyyah's Metaethics. Why? Because this is not a post-classical view. This isn't something new or novel to Ibn Taymiyyah. This isn't something that he came up with. There's ijma on this. There is no difference of opinion that in the case of somebody starving or dying of thirst, they can even drink alcohol or eat pork or eat carrion, etc., etc. And this isn't even something that jurists came up with through extracting things from the Quran. It's directly mentioned in the Quran. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times in the Quran. So let me give you just one example, and I'm going to end it on this point here. In Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 173. It says here in the Quran, He has only forbidden to you dead animals, blood, the flesh of wine, and that which has been dedicated to other than Allah. But whoever is forced by necessity, neither denying it nor transgressing its limits, there is no sin upon him. Indeed, Allah is forgiving and merciful. So the things that are prohibited to eat, including carrion, including pork, etc., etc., it's not that Ibn Taymiyyah comes up with because of some philosophical view or underpinnings, oh, but there may be some cases where it may be a necessity to eat, or he's deriving this from certain legal axioms or usul al-fiqh or anything. No, the very verse itself, which prohibits it, explicitly says, but here's an exception to the rule: whoever is forced by necessity, neither denying it nor transgressing it, then what? There's no sin upon him. He's not guilty. He can do it in that situation. Why? Indeed, Allah is forgiving and merciful, because he's strapped down. He needs to do it in that situation. So to even mention this as a point of note in an article, in an academic work on Ibn Taymiyyah representing his metaethics, this is just really strange. It serves no place in there to represent in the context of Ibn Taymiyyah as a post-classical jurist. This is an opinion that Ibn Taymiyyah came up with. It's directly in the Quran, mentioned 4 times in the Quran, repeated with the same phraseology. So it's just very strange to me. Now, I want to zoom back after people think that I've been picking on John Hoover too much, and go back all the way to the beginning to remind you this isn't just to condemn John Hoover. I don't care about that. This is to go back to the beginning, that I said it's extremely difficult to position that John Hoover, or anybody who tries to do what he's doing in this field. You got to be an expert in Arabic, in the particular thinker, in the milieu, and everything that's happening and going around at the time. Then, on top of that, you have to be an expert in English. You have to be an expert in modern philosophy. You have to be an expert in how to match the terms up properly, not only with just the wording, but with the meaning properly. All of this is extremely difficult, and unfortunately, for John Hoover, who claims to be, or many people see him as an expert on Ibn Taymiyyah in this field, it's just, I hate to say it, but it's really not a good attempt from John Hoover, okay? And if he is an expert in this field, then what I'm trying to make the point of with this video is a wider point to Muslims. Not only Muslims, but non-Muslims who are studying Islam. We should be extremely cautious, because people who are being put forward as experts in their respective fields on these topics, and it's not only John Hoover, I can show you numerous other examples, and I'll probably do this in the future, they're not actually very well read in the areas that they're speaking on, because they lack in one or more of the 3 necessary areas to actually convey the idea. And I'm not saying John Hoover is malicious. I don't know his intentions. But some of those examples are just, quite frankly, I have to say it, embarrassing from a scholar, somebody who's supposed to be a head scholar in the field, who is who people I know personally are studying their PhDs under, and they are approving of their works. And there are other blunders that I could point out, which I haven't even mentioned. from John Hoover. This is just one article. So Muslims and even non-Muslims need to be extremely cautious. And this indicates a much greater problem with Western academia and its study of Islam, and not only Islam, to be fair, probably Christianity and Hinduism and other religions as well. So we have to be very careful. We have to actually do properly our studies, think about these things more deeply. Don't just take it for granted just because a guy has a PhD and he's published in these works and he's published by Oxford and so on and so forth. Not to disrespect them in that way, but that doesn't therefore give you a pass and say, oh yeah, they definitely know what they're talking about. That's certainly not the case at all. And that's just being quite frank with you guys. And again, it's not only John Hoover, it's many other of these so-called, and I'm not saying that to be pejorative, but Western academics. It's a very deep problem. I believe truly, not in the case of John Hoover, but other times it actually is malicious and maybe even intentional, because if people are reading you and think that you have some type of authority and are putting forward an idea, then they can be intentionally misleading you, and then people go wrong with the wrong idea. I don't think that's what John Hoover's doing. Nevertheless, I hope that this video was beneficial to caution us about this greater problem and to try to draw attention to it. I have no ill will towards John Hoover. I hope that he fixes some of these mistakes. I mean, the last one on not only the epistemology issue, which contradicts the previous section on his ontology, and the metaethics one is just so bad. But even to represent Ibn Taymiyyah as a physicalist or materialist, to repeat again, Ibn Taymiyyah is not a physicalist or materialist. He believes that there are mental realities, things that exist only in the mind, which don't exist in physical reality, and therefore is a conceptualist with respect to universals, laws of logic, etc., and he believes that they really do exist, even the senses like hunger, joy, and so on, and feeling the existence of your own soul. All of those things are real, they really exist, and they're not necessarily sensed by any of the 5 outer senses that he initially mentioned. They're not physical or purely materialist entities. And I mentioned, and I showed, according to the physicalist entry on the Stanford page, that Ibn Taymiyyah is perhaps better understood as a property dualist, in which he does believe in the existence of mental categories and realities that are not purely reduced to physical or material means. This is extremely important because we know Ibn Taymiyyah is being accused of being a mujassim, believing that God has a body, and John Hoover even intimated that in the other part of the article, and other slanders against Ibn Taymiyyah, saying that he believed in tashbih, etc. And so when you paint Ibn Taymiyyah in this way and make him seem like, oh, he has this very simplistic notion, he believes anything can be perceived with all 5 senses, this is another potential danger. I'm not saying John Hoover is doing this, but when you link that to the already misconceptions about Ibn Taymiyyah and his thought overall, and the distortions that have been used against him, that makes it even more alarming and dangerous. With that being said, guys, I hope that you found this video educational. Some people were interested. A lot of people have been spreading this article around, people using it in a negative way against Ibn Taymiyyah, Muslims, to support their slanders and lies against Ibn Taymiyyah, unfortunately, and I don't believe that was John Hoover's intention. Other people sharing around who like Ibn Taymiyyah and are now going around calling him a physical or materialist because John Hoover is representing it that way, which is also wrong. So that's the point of clarification, and also to make a wider point about why we should be a bit skeptical of Western academics and their studies of Islam, and be a bit more skeptical and critical of what their findings are and what they're reporting. With that being said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more like it and support the channel, the best way to do so is to share this video, subscribe if you haven't already, turn a notification bell on so you get notified of future videos. like this video and the other ones that you like. Maybe you don't like all of them, but you like this one. So like this video and the videos that you do like. Comment on the video. Really does help with the algorithm. Unfortunately, we have to play that game, and it's extremely important. Share this video so that people who may be confused, or you want to give them an understanding about maybe some of the potential problems of Western academia and studying Islam from that lens and researching it from that lens, share it on your social media platforms, no matter how big or how small they are, or with your friends and family who may be interested in these subjects. And if you want to go above and beyond, then as I mentioned, guys, I'm doing this full time now, so I rely to some degree on your support. The best way to support me is to go to the GoFundMe link, which is pinned at the top of the description of this video, as well as my other videos, to keep the channel and my work running. But until next time, guys, inshallah, again, no ill will towards John Hoover. I'll see you all again next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.